Oh, we're live? It just told me that I'm not live, so I'm not sure why it's gone and done that. My apologies for the silence there for a few seconds. YouTube said it wasn't working, and apparently it is. So, how is everyone? We're going to be doing a response stream today to something rather short. I mean, nowhere near as long as I think it was 25-minute one that the lady did. One that's around about 8 minutes and 44 seconds from everyone's favourite Rationality rules. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of him. Now, he comes out with some interesting points in this, I think it's fair to say. Okay, I should probably just show you this, because it does represent. This is how a lot of atheists actually think, and it really goes to show how little many of them actually know, right? So bear in mind, don't insult this fellow as we're streaming, because there's going to be plenty of occasion for that. I will warn you, but there's no need to, because he comes out with some very misguided things, and although he himself isn't dishonest, the whole movement as a whole, the whole atheist movement as a whole, seems to be labouring under this delusion that it's merely a lack of belief, when it clearly isn't, and it clearly pushes for actual positive points of view, which we can observe. Empirically, in fact, we can scientifically test for the materialism, that being physicalism, the metaphysical material monism, for those philosophically inclined. There's clearly an ideology here, and he pretends as if there isn't. So, $5 says he's a former Calvinist / Mormon. I don't know, but if he's in Britain, he probably has some sort of Calvinist influence. So it should be showing itself. Let's see if it will appear up on the... Yeah, there we go. Right, so he begins with a story. We'll just do as usual. If you guys want to add questions and such, I will occasionally check. So he believes... In essence, what he's saying here is that Christianity is actually lying about its claims to humility, which, as I think many of us know, this is not the case. So, let's start.
When I was 13, my granddad took me to the top of Brading Downs on the Isle of Wight to watch shooting stars. We had cheesy chips, tea, and I saw a sight that I'll never forget.
By the way, cheesy chips, they're delicious. So I can at least support him in his choice of snack. Especially when the cheese isn't entirely melted, but it's not entirely solid either.
After a few showers, he explained to me that shooting stars are not actually stars at all, but rather meteors, rocks that enter our atmosphere, collide with air molecules, and consequently leave a glow in their wake.
Thank you, Morty. Sorry, I should have said that.
I mustn't pretend to recall the evening in its entirety, or more accurately the morning, but if memory serves me well, after a moment of contemplation, I replied, I can understand why shooting stars are so poorly named. To our ignorant and terrified ancestors...
Ignorant and terrified ancestors. This fellow here, he actually appears to have a very long track record of getting our terrified and ignorant ancestors exceptionally wrong. Because they weren't terrified, and they certainly weren't ignorant. For example, I'm actually trying to find it on my screen, right? There's a video that he did the other day where he has this thumbnail. I don't actually have the screenshot. I've lost it somewhere. It's somewhere in the void. Where he talks about the Kalam cosmological argument. But in the thumbnail he has St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, if he knew quite so much about our ignorant and terrified ancestors. But, the ones that were in the habit of leaping out of ships in full plate armour and charging castles that they didn't know the garrisons of, he would know that St. Thomas Aquinas actually didn't like the Kalam cosmological argument and made an entirely different one. But never mind. Never mind. We'll take it as a given.
Meteors would have been, minus their speed, indistinguishable from the stars behind them.
Well, yeah, that's why we call them shooting stars, because they look like it. I don't think that. I don't think there's much. I don't think you've provided any evidence whatsoever to assume that the ancients and medievals thought of the shooting stars that we see as night as, stars. Now, they may well have, but this wouldn't actually support your argument that they were terrified and somehow ignorant, especially when you yourself are ignorant of their knowledge. Because, like all periods of history, there are certain strengths and weaknesses, and one of the strengths of the Middle Ages was the incredible emphasis on the liberal arts, which we simply don't have now. We've got very good engineering. We've got even then we don't really have very good natural sciences for a number of reasons, but we have very good engineering, and that's one of the strengths of this time, just like Imperial Rome. But there are different times for different things.
Is reflected in a great many religious texts. At this point, I was already in awe, but then my granddad imparted a fact that cracked the core of my entire world, and to this day I still feel its reverberations. But I'll get to that in due course. First, I want to properly introduce the topic of this video. This is a break from my typical style of content, in which I combat religious and pseudoscientific claims.
Wait. You combat pseudoscientific claims? Isn't that the job of the academy, of the universities? Also, if those religious claims happen to be true, why would you combat them? If they were true.
Or comment on the rhetoric of religious and pseudoscientific apes.
Also, why would you associate pseudoscience with religion when one was literally spawned from another? The universities of Europe were almost exclusively founded by monastic orders. At least the ones in Britain. Oxford and Cambridge were formed by... Cambridge specifically. I get them mixed up which way around it is, but one of them was founded by Dominican friars. A lot of these grew out of monastic schools. Likewise, in the Muslim world, the universities came out of trying to synthesize Islamic theology with other fields. That's why they're called universities, the bringing of the liberal arts, the sciences, and the social sciences together.
To have a rant. You can thus perceive this as a futile attempt to maintain my sanity.
The greatest strength that I have is that I don't assume my sanity. I think I am insane. But you should never trust yourself, because you are very easily deceived. And this is one of the weaknesses that I had as an atheist, and that these quote-unquote rationalists in general have. They never ever stop and think that maybe more intelligent and more powerful forces than them may be committed not only to getting their money, but also changing their mind to think things that are not necessarily in their best interest, but in the interests of the people providing the ideas. Which is a trend throughout human history, and especially right now. Now, how would I substantiate this claim? I'd point to the existence of Edward Bernays. But anyway, let's continue.
And perhaps, if you share my frustrations, yours too. In recent years, largely, I have to say, because of Brexit, I've become painfully aware of the corrosive nature of echo chambers and have consequently sought to avoid them.
So you voted leave?
Or at the very least, step outside of those close to my heart regularly enough to recognise them. Ironically, this has led to me spending more time around religious people than irreligious people, which I almost recommend, if only because it enhances the gift of being around those who are, as Pascal put it, so made as not to believe.
Maybe you could read a bit more of Pascal. Maybe you'd find something perhaps saner than this very new logical positivism that atheist YouTubers tend to posit without even being aware of it. Hey ho.
One such group in which the God Squad is strong is at my table tennis club. Most of the members are Christian, and yes, like the vast majority of modern Christians, outside of the central tenets, none of them share the same views. They are stellar examples of cafeteria Christianity.
What do you mean by the core beliefs? Or do you mean the creeds? This is left ambiguous. Now, perhaps if you spent more time around religious people, you'd be able to quantify this in a better way. Now, if I sound perhaps that I'm being uncharitable with this fellow, you'll see later on in the video I'm bearing in mind the rest of the video because he makes some. Well, we'll see. We'll see.
The average age of the community, like many table tennis clubs in the UK, is just short of 70. And so if you're looking for a reason for the high religiosity in an otherwise largely atheistic country, then there you have it. The league itself is comprised of teams from all around Hampshire, and most of the clubs, including our own, operate from either a converted or active church. This, naturally, spurs a lot of banter. They mock me for utilising the generous lease granted by the church, and I remind them that they're welcome, since it's my tax that predicates their freeloading faith.
Well, I mean, they did pay taxes for 50 years. Yes, freeloading. You see, this is why I'm glad that we don't have selective tax systems. Because if we had opt-out tax, then there'd be a lot of problems, because most people don't realise the necessities of these things. Or they outright say that they're unnecessary. They're wrong, but, you know.
Which now so graciously offers it back to me at a premium. When they win a game against me, they playfully thank Jesus. And when I win a game against them, I playfully thank Santa.
Do you seriously do this? I really struggle to imagine somebody actually doing this. Like, I've known a lot of irreligious people. I've been an atheist myself. I don't think I. Okay, I don't know if this channel just exists to. Never mind. I won't say that.
When I lose an important match, they tell me that if I'd only prayed, I would have won. And when they lose an important match, I tell them that I didn't pray for them because I didn't want to distract their God from his current occupation of giving aid to children in Africa.
I wasn't aware that these old people worship the UN.
Humour is, as often noted, a great way to break tension, and we hit each other with it fairly hard. And honestly, I'd have it no other way. I'm sure, however, that every once in a while I overstep the mark, as do they when they celebrate the notion of me burning in hell for eternity for the crime of using the brain that apparently their God gave me.
You have been? I mean, I've already pointed out. You know, if you really wanted to use the brain that God gave you, you might, instead of, as my friend Mathoma has pointed out, making really poor arguments against people like St. Thomas Aquinas, maybe you would learn Latin and read the texts themselves and try to get acclimatized to the intellectual climate that Aquinas was writing in. I mean, although I didn't do this, I certainly realized that, as an atheist, I inherited from the Christian tradition, and inherited from philosophical traditions, and as Christians introduced me to books by famous philosophers that I recognized as people contributing profoundly to the civilization that I lived in, I increasingly became more convinced of the first principles of those people.
But at the end of the day, sticks and stones. One bit of banter, however, really gets under my skin. Not because it's offensive, but because it's so absurd. And that is the Christian boasts of humility.
Oh. This is an interesting part. And it actually says a lot more about atheism as a viewpoint than it does about Christianity.
Which in and of itself is a contradiction. Christians frequently call themselves humble for their beliefs, and either implicitly or explicitly call me, the atheist, arrogant.
Well, you see, the trick is to realise that we're both very arrogant. for different reasons, but nonetheless.
For insert speculative reason here. Now, I have no delusions of grandeur.
I'm sorry, but like those are famous last words. Because almost everyone has delusions of grandeur in some sense.
I've been accused of arrogance in the past, and in some cases rightfully so. But to quote Christopher Hitchens, to claim that I am privy to the secrets of the universe and its creator, that's beyond my conceit.
I don't know, isn't this the same Christopher Hitchens that would go on about science constantly? Don't you think that may be the secrets of the universe in and of itself? Do you think that maybe one side is pretending not to have a worldview and the other doesn't pretend to have a worldview?
All religions, of course, boast of humility. In the Torah, Numbers 12, verse 3 states that Moses was exceedingly humble, more so than any person on the face of the earth. And the etymology of the word Islam is generally interpreted to mean submission to God, humility. But for Christianity, the claims of humility are much more pronounced, and for this reason, they are a more prominent part of their apologetic arsenal. Blessed are the meek, so says the book of Matthew. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. And Philippians 2, verse 3, to give just one more example, warns, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves.
Yes, this is advice.
Indeed, unlike the submission of Islam, which is not humility, but rather servitude.
Well, you see, the thing is this is where he makes the mistake. I'll explain what he thinks humility is in a moment, but in essence, humility is in fact submission to the truth. You don't get to make a decision about what the truth is. And Islam claims to have the truth, and it submits to that perceived truth. It may be false, objectively speaking, but they at least prize the submission to the truth. And indeed, that is servitude to the truth. If you submit to the truth, you serve it, and the ability to recognize and submit to this truth is in itself humility, because you are putting the truth above yourself.
Many biblical verses do legitimately encourage humility. So what's the issue, one might ask? The issue is that these verses are predicated upon sheer arrogance. And
oh yeah? We will see in a moment what he means by sheer arrogance.
Here is where my rant starts. Christians believe that there is one perfect God. And
yes!
that we are created in its image.
Yes.
Which is a not so subtle way of saying that we are, or are close to, perfect.
In our creation we were very good. Yes.
Concerning humility, this isn't exactly a good start.
Isn't it? Or is it a submission to the truth in itself? Because we are. We have fallen as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve, and we must acknowledge this. We simultaneously acknowledge that we are but dust, which God formed in his likeness and image. Now, this acknowledgement that we are but dust, in fact, if you wanted to go and quote the scriptures some more, you could go and look at, I think it's Genesis chapter 12, where Abram at that point goes to God, I am but earth and ash. But you don't. There is no contradiction between thinking that we are in the likeness and image of God, which we are by virtue of our rational intellect, and us being earth and ash. There is nothing arrogant about recognizing a truth of human existence. It's like you're insisting that you've got like massive tentacles and you can climb a tree. That's arrogant because that would be deluded. It would also be arrogant because it would be asserting that human beings have a faculty beyond what they actually have. Likewise, it wouldn't be humble if I were to hack my hand off and say that human beings only have one hand when they're supposed to have two.
Is it? Granted, due to discovering many flaws with our apparatus, such as the appendix, wisdom teeth, and visual blind spot, many denominations now merely claim that our being created in the image of God is a metaphor for our ascension above.
This doesn't contradict a single thing. Like, we are the image of the invisible God. Well, we are in the likeness and image of God, right? We are not God. If we were God, then this would be a contradiction. But it isn't. You know, I can look at this rationality rules fellow here, and look at him in the screen, and I'll perceive a part of him, but I will perceive him imperfectly. I won't know the true rationality rules until I meet him in a pub in Hampshire or London, shake his hand, and buy him a beer. And then I will have a certain sense of him, but not the entire sense as well. It's a reduction in definition. And it doesn't in any way preclude imperfection.
All other animals. But even this contorted interpretation stinks of the hubris of us being chosen by the Almighty himself.
Yes! Yes, this is the truth. This isn't someone saying that they're somehow like... This is a submission to the truth. This isn't conceited, because it's exactly the level that man is at.
Again, I say, not a good start. But as if this wasn't already a big enough slice of the not-so-humble pie, most Christians believe that the universe was created with us in mind.
Yes, like everything else. Now, very interesting how he's tearing into the tenets of the Christian faith, and yet he won't even explore his own assertions. His belief that the world is inherently material, the seeming belief that the world is meaningless, which is in itself kind of ridiculous and baseless and without evidence. In fact, this is actually one of the primary problems of scientists, this assumption of materialism, which is not scientifically provable, because the scientific method in itself isn't material. I'll tell you what, like, go use the scientific method to prove the scientific method.
That we are a vital part of a grand divine plan.
Yes.
And that our consciousness will continue to exist long after the atoms that comprise us have been scattered to the winds.
Well, it's because our souls aren't actually material. They aren't atoms. They are immaterial. And interestingly enough, if this fellow wishes to dismiss this eternality of the soul as somehow arrogant, and if we think that arrogance blinds us to reality, then he has to dismiss pretty much all of the philosophers of science, from Aristotle through to Descartes, at the very least.
What's more, many Christians insist that they have a personal, one-to-one relationship with God himself.
Yes, this isn't because we're somehow brilliant, it's because God is. God sustains the whole universe. Of course he's got a personal relationship with us.
That they have interacted with or received messages from angels, and that God not only hears their prayers, but answers them.
Yes! This does not somehow make someone arrogant.
Indeed, in the mind of such a Christian, God rewrites his perfect plan in accordance to their selfish preferences.
No, he actually doesn't. He actually sticks... He actually controls everything, right? As we know from St. Augustine. And we act in accordance with that because he permits us to or actively wills us to. So no, he doesn't change his plan around us. We act within his bounds. If we decide to do something, it's because God permitted us to think it. There's no change on the part of God. God does not change. And you'd know this if you, in your debunking of Christianity, looked into the attributes of God.
Just so that they can, for instance, win a game at table tennis.
Well, I mean, that might actually be an actual grace in some cases, because say an atheist gets annihilated at a game of table tennis against like a 95-year-old Christian woman, that might lead the atheist into a position of doubt, and to perhaps get to know that woman on account of her skill at ping pong, and then of course things can proceed forward.
It has to be said, this is extravagant arrogance.
It is.
And to downplay it by referencing a handful of peculiar humble verses is preposterous. It's somehow worse than Alexander the Great naming...
Wait, isn't that the painting of the burning of Sodom and Gomorrah in the background? It looks like the one that's modelled on the burning down of the city of Cologne.
70 cities after himself, and then insinuating humility due to his participating in their conquest. Yes, it's an act of humility to acknowledge the presence of someone or something wiser than oneself. but to do so only in predication of the extraordinarily arrogant tenets of Christianity is absurd in the highest degree.
Wait, so you see, this entire thing has just been not even really critiquing the truth of Christianity in so much as suggesting, well, you have these objective views of reality and they're offensive to me, and so I'm going to call them arrogant or something. So this is as if the same scientists don't make the same claims, and even more absurd ones, right? For example, they will assert that human beings are entirely material, and so only that which can be seen is what constitutes a human being. Now, at the same time, they will assert something that they'll assert a number of different contradictions. Let's start with a few. First of all, they will assume that we can actually have a legal system. This is probably the least offensive one. I'll come out with the more offensive ones in a second. So, you have human beings, and because they are entirely material, they behave as closed systems under the obediences of the natural law, of the laws of nature, and I mean this in a physical sense, not in the sense of natural moral law. So you have this entirely deterministic system, and yet you can have a legal system that holds people culpable. How can somebody be culpable if they're deterministic? Now, I'm sure this fellow here wouldn't want us to close down all of the courts, because say his friend was murdered, he would probably want that person to go to prison, and this would require a court to determine whether or not this was first or second degree murder. Now, second degree murder is murder that is on the spot, on the cusp, and first degree murder is that which is premeditated. There is a distinction in the culpability in these things, because one is a spur of the moment thing and another one is premeditated. Now, if we are entirely material things, and we therefore have no ability no ability to possess free will, let alone to plan, then this distinction is completely meaningless. And likewise is punishing someone for culpabilities, because they literally can't do anything wrong, because there is no culpability, because the human being is completely deterministic. Likewise, these people... Now, we can hold this, actually. I want to make it very clear that I do believe trans people exist. And this is something that this guy's gotten into trouble with before. There seems to be a contradiction between human beings being entirely material and someone being trapped in the wrong body. Now, sometimes they'll try and wheedle their way out of this and say something along the lines of, well, transgender men have the same brainwaves as women. And that would be true. And you know why that's true? Because men have the same brainwaves as women. At the same time, they'll say things like, oh, the brain has been warped, ergo they must be different. Well, you know what also warps brains? Pornography and heroin addiction. Just because a human brain has been warped does not mean that it is warping to something that is a part of reality. Now, a Christian who believes that the immaterial precedes the material and the material proceeds from that can indeed believe in the existence of trans people, particularly if they take a more Platonic view of the mind. But the atheist can't. Thirdly, they can't believe in any form of equality at all, because equality in a material sense would consist in people being made up of exactly the same matter and being in the exact same state and the exact same position as everyone else. It also means that there can't be justices for particular minority groups, because they don't believe that minorities can exist. Because, necessarily speaking, groups are immaterial objects, and if you believe in materialism, you're necessarily forced into a form of nominalism, where groups can't have rights, because they're only names. Now, I don't think that this Rationality rules fellow who does not make clear his own cards, but will have a go at someone else's cards, is actually banking on the fact that people will pick up on this. That they will assume that because the majority of, I'd say this is a Protestantizing sort of tendency. These sorts of brainwashed Christians who believe in private judgment will just say, that's just your opinion, bro. Now, unfortunately for him, the Christian tradition that was cast out of this land in the 1530s, and once again at the end of the 1550s, actually did hold absolute truth and did not believe in private judgment. And so we have these rigid beliefs and these rigid philosophical systems that we can use. But he seems to think that we don't recognise these same tendencies in himself. And he may even not be aware of this. He may have actually had this brainwashed into him by a school system that wants him to believe this. Now, why would a society benefit from having a class of people who are fundamentally atheist? Well, because when you're an atheist, you, at least in theory, have no necessary virtue. You don't need virtue because there's no sins to avoid, aside from those which the conscience will poke you with from time to time. Those natural things that the French Revolution tried to provoke and bring back into power, but it didn't really work. Even less so now. So you've got a bunch of people running around without a moral system, first of all, and second of all, without God helping them out, because they lack a belief in him, even though God tries his best. So you've now got a bunch of people incredibly vulnerable to low-hanging passions. Things like desires for different forms of sex, desires for food, desires for purchasing things, desires for power. And people who have these sorts of vices and seem to think that these aren't a problem, aside from when they're diagnosed by a doctor, in the case of alcohol addiction, they're dominated by those things. And there's a very good reason why sex addiction isn't something that is really prescribed against and promoted in medical literature. And it's because the people who are under sexual addictions are the most easy to control, because lust is the thing after pride that dulls the intellect the most. So you've got a drone class of people who don't even know what virtue is, that are satiated in their passions and are unable to think at a higher level as by virtue of being clouded by these passions. And this makes, first of all, for a very good worker class that isn't really going to question anything as long as they get the fix of the girl down the road. It also means that there aren't going to be many people working to compete with the higher corporations, because you need virtue to actually run companies effectively. And thirdly, it also makes people docile and easy to influence, because if you've got people operating on a lower level of passion, then they're as easy to manipulate as their emotions are. And if this person doesn't believe me, there are literally thousands of years worth of writings on how to do this. Bernays being one of the most recent ones.
Christianity is not and has never been humble.
Thank you.
Christianity is as humble as Islam is peaceful and North Korea is a democracy.
Well, the thing is that you could actually make a case that North Korea is democratic, because, you see, democracies don't always consist in voting. North Korea is democratic in the sense that if its people were angry enough, they could overthrow the government if they wanted to. In fact, Michel Foucault makes this exact argument for the death penalty. If people really didn't want somebody to be executed, they'd storm into the prison and rescue the person. But of course, this doesn't make any sense to a westernized person. So, well, hey ho.
There is nothing humble about asserting that the universe revolves around you.
Well, if it actually does orbit around human beings as a species, then it is, because you are submitting to the truth.
Okay, rant over. Let's end where we began, by hopping back into my granddad's truck. While sipping on my third or fourth tea, gazing at the stars, my granddad got out of the truck and rustled around in the cargo bed. A few minutes later, he opened the passenger door, and before me was his telescope, pointing at what seemed to be a relatively big, though not particularly bright star. As I gazed upon it, my granddad said to me, "Son, that is Alpha Seer, And if there is a planet orbiting it, and upon that planet there is a member of a species with a telescope powerful enough to look back at us, then they are currently looking at the dinosaurs, since the light that enveloped the Earth 72 million years ago is only now reaching Alpha Centauri. The great Carl Sagan once
journalist
said that astronomy is a humbling experience, and it's facts such as those taught to me by my granddad that embody this truth. When I look at the night sky, I see an endless sea of galaxies, each with billions of stars, billions of planets, and since life emerged on Earth within at least 1 billion years, I assume the existence of billions of other organisms. This
What evidence you... Wait a minute. I thought that extraordinary claims had required extraordinary evidence. How can you assert that there are beings on other planets when we have no evidence for this?
Makes me feel utterly insignificant. I am a single member of a pattern-seeking primate on a mote of dust, suspended in a brief moment of time.
You see, this is an example of one of the real problems with the modern world. They assume because something is small that it is unimportant. I'm sorry, but Alexander the Great was a probably rather small Greek man, and he was kind of important. This isn't like, this is like saying, oh, this cardboard box over here that is 10 feet tall and is filled with a gigantic fridge, it's more important than me because it's bigger than me. This isn't how it works.
And in a cosmic blink, I will forever cease to be. And yet Christians, which still see themselves as the access of all this vastness.
Yes, yes, I do. I do see human beings as the centre of all of this beautiful creation, right? You know why? Because I don't put bigger things, as in like physically bigger things, above me in my importance, or likewise those smaller than me as bigger than me in my importance. My mum is shorter than me. I consider her more important than I am. For example.
Have the audacity to call me arrogant and themselves humble. Yeah, right.
Yeah. I can't read your character, but the fact that you made this and then at the same time won't admit your own worldview, it's not looking good for you, mate. Anyway, let's see what questions there were, because I saw the chat going a bit doolally there. I hope I wasn't overly unpleasant about the fellow. Our liberal arts are trash. Yeah. Yeah, they don't teach things very well. Just admit that wasn't it Daniel Dennett that said that atheists should rename themselves to brights because they're bright? Let's see. We'll answer questions now. I'll go on to the Riot server at riot.renaissancemen.com, .xyz even. I wish it were .com, and I'll see if there are any questions, because I noticed that a few people stuck questions on there for the last stream, and I seem to remember there may be at least one or two sitting there for this one coming. Does the internet make it easier to spread the good news? Yes, it does. I mean, I'd have thought this would have been relatively clear, but hey-ho. Imagine Rationality rules reacting to someone telling him what the Eucharist is. Yeah, I mean, it's just a small a small blood and body of Christ under the species of bread and wine. It's so tiny, yet it contains all creation. Scientists are beginning to admit that the universe has an anthropic principle inherent within it. You cannot explain consciousness. Yes. He's just like, you see, this is the thing. As I made clear, I'm just reading through the chat earlier on. Right, this guy will call religions arrogant for asserting articles of faith, and then he will obscure his own. Let's see. The guy needs to. I mean, the thing is that if he actually sits and reads these books, which I really doubt he will, um, he might actually come out with a more mature view of reality. But I don't think he will. I think he's like he. Like, I mean, if you wanted to truly make an argument for atheism, you'd be citing Nietzsche. You wouldn't be citing, what's his name, Carl Sagan. I mean, even Nietzsche tore into these people when he talked about English flatheads in, I think it was Beyond Good and Evil. It might be Genealogy. No, it's definitely Beyond Good and Evil. These people who, on one hand, will hold to the nice parts of immateriality and God and such, and then on the other hand, will try and subscribe to an atheistic belief, and it just doesn't work because it violates the law of non-contradiction. Although, obviously, Nietzsche, not being a particularly logical thinker, does not reference the law of non-contradiction. I think he probably insults them. Protestantism led to atheism. Yeah. Do you think that there was a literal Adam and Eve? Or is the story a metaphor? No, there was a literal Adam and Eve. We have mitochondrial evidence of mitochondrial Eve and mitochondrial Adam. Now, there will be people who will say, oh, these people didn't exist at the same time. Right, so who did mitochondrial Eve mate with? And who did mitochondrial Adam mate with? Did they go from being fully human to kind of not fully human, and then things just sort of mix together? So can we just mix the essences? Or are they immutable? Yeah, Adam and Eve literally existed. And the fact that there's scientific evidence for this isn't gonna... It's never gonna cross Rationality Rule's mind, because I don't think he even knows really what science is. Most of these people don't. It's this kind of obscure reference to science documentaries on the Discovery Channel from the late 1980s to the mid-2000s, mostly. It's not even the actual science that's going on in universities. Because the universities, the scientists, as much as I might have a problem with some scientists and some academics, they at least try to debate these ideas in a way that's high resolution. Most of these people, they don't put the time in to really get an idea of what they're even arguing for, let alone what they're arguing against. Whereas, at least... I mean, Lawrence Krauss won't even do this, and he's a doctor of physics. So, I mean, I can only hope that there are more dedicated academics in universities. Most of the atheist ones are Marxists. So at least they have a philosophical framework with which to address the world. Most of these kinds of new atheist types don't, because they don't know what they're talking about in terms of their own views. Let's see. I mean, they have no evidence for the existence of aliens, but they'll continually assert it. Seraphim Rose, in his book Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, essentially asserted that aliens were something of which there is a lot more proof, and that is demons. Now, any new atheist watching this will be like, oh, there's proof of demons? You must be living on another planet. You must be living in fairyland. Well, no, I'm not, because we have volumes and volumes of writings about saints and history that invoke these things. If you look past the arbitrary time window of 1700 to 2020, we have reams and reams of paper on these things. We even have manuals for dealing with them. Do you think that the exorcists are being paid by the financially struggling diocese because they look nice? Or do you think that they might actually have a purpose? But then again, if you were to acknowledge this, you would be forced to drop a thoroughly inconsistent worldview. But how can all humanity come out of just two people? In the Bible, it says Cain fled to a town after killing Abel. Well, you see, the thing is with the generations in Genesis, they aren't strictly generations in the way we think of them. They don't even name all of the members in between necessarily. They're not Like, this is the problem with a lot of the biblical literalists. They will assume it's literal time when it isn't always the case. They'll also assume things like the scripture lists all of the sons of Adam, when that's not always the case unless explicitly stated. This is how they could also have wives as well. Note how the daughters aren't listed in Genesis as well. Y chromosomal Adam was it, not mitochondrial. My mistake, Isidore. Like, you know, the Bible is inherently true in terms of faith and morals, but it's not exhaustive. That's why science began in, well, it did. Well, I mean, it began with the Greeks, but it really blossomed under Christianity, particularly after the reintroduction of the Aristotelian writings. How is he getting meaning from pure materialism? He isn't. Actually, I'm going to test something out. I'm going to go grab some water. I have a change in screen, and it plays music. So if you guys like the music, please let me know. I'll be back in a second. Oh. Yeah, there we go. There might have been a bit of an echo there because I wanted to test it myself. Did he ever define humility and arrogance? No, he didn't. So, it's all rhetoric. How do you improve your understanding of philosophy? You read them. You read philosophers and you talk to people of different viewpoints. And how do you respond to people like him when you know them in person? With the greatest possible charity. I could have done a better job here, but it's very hard to respond to such arrogance that was expressed here with charity. And I tried my best. I think I did a reasonable job, aside from perhaps mocking it at one point. Way too loud. Okay. Yeah, that was literally just a first test. Oh. How this is gonna go. So, yeah, I just wanted to see if it worked. It was something I put together. How do Marxists get teleology and meaning if they are historical materialists? They don't. They don't. Krauss pretty much became a clown in my eyes with the book about a universe from nothing. I can't believe an educated person would write this. I mean, this was a principle that has been held since the very beginning of philosophy. The last 250 years have been like a reverse evolution from Aristotle back down to the atomists and Thales of Miletus. I think it was Miletus, Anaxagoras and Anaximander. It's been a true societal degeneration. It's like the genealogies in John's. They're obviously that there haven't been just 28 generations before Jesus was born. It's a literary device. Well, it's not even necessarily just that. It's partly a literary device, but there's, of course, infinite meaning to it by virtue of its author. There are certain names omitted for certain reasons, and there are certain names that are there for other reasons. In fact, the one in the Gospel of Matthew is there specifically to invoke memories of the characters of the Old Testament before somebody gets into the life of Christ, and to remind the reader that there is in fact continuation here and that these aren't two separate hewn universes. How can you get your thinking away from an indoctrinated materialism? Literally just read old books. How should we approach pagan/atheist philosophers, beyond Plato and Aristotle, of course, who provide a lot of the framework for later Christian development? You need to be catechized very well, and you need to know the philosophical arguments of the Christian and the earlier atheist philosophers very well. Because most of the time what you'll find with modern philosophy is that it's so poor in quality that it will collapse immediately under any kind of scrutiny. There's a reason why these people, particularly, I'm not so much thinking of Hegel, but I'm thinking more of the continental philosophers. There's a reason why they use very complicated language, and that is to obscure some of the logical inconsistencies in their views. It also helps to split it also helps to split academe from the general population and make themselves a more distinct class. Yes, Kono, it was an intermission. There we go. Yeah, okay, so that was Y chromosome will Adam. Devil's advocate. If God sustains and determines all things, how on a Christian worldview is there free will? Well, because God created man in his likeness and image, and part of that image and likeness is free will. So God sustains that. Although he can indeed overrule it, as he did to Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 8, I want to say, when he hardens Pharaoh's heart. There's a combinationalism to, I think it's called combinationalism, to free will, right? You have indeterminism in the way you behave, and it's determined by your intellect and will. But that doesn't mean that your will always be carried out in the same way that God's will is infallible. Is there anything to gain by, say, Kierkegaard, Hume, and Aurelius? Marcus Aurelius. Well, Marcus Aurelius certainly. He gives you a better idea of the world that people like St. Ignatius of Antioch were writing in. And a lot of the time, what's written in those books is true and often incorporated by later Christian writers. There's a reason why a lot of it was copied down. As for Hume and people like that, for example, for myself, I'm thinking very strongly about taking, for my master's degree, as one of the modules, a double unit in philosophy, in the philosophy of cognitive science and artificial intelligence. Now, I already know that I'm going to walk into that room and disagree with effectively everyone there, because I believe that the intellect and the will are immaterial. So what this has given me the motivation to do is to properly sit down and learn the philosophy of mind of Aristotle, Plotinus, Plato, Aquinas, St. Augustine, and others. So I can really not only steelman the arguments of people like Donald Hebb, who professed materialism, but also absolutely annihilate them in front of a number of professors who will probably have never read these works. Because if I've learnt anything from university, it's that academics tend to be extremely focused in on one area, and their interests generally don't stray over into things like philosophy of mind from times before maybe 1650. They don't really know the world that, say, Descartes was writing in, because they don't seem to, at least, have spent much time to read people like Athanasius Kircher or Grosseteste or any of the scientists of the Renaissance age. Particularly since those people tend to be associated with beliefs that they find very uncomfortable. As the uncaused cause, isn't God responsible for everything that happens? Yeah, he has active and permissive will. So active will is, good things, and permissive will are, strictly speaking, culpable things, wherein God thinks that good can knows that good can emerge from those things. There's also, like, you see, people will say, oh well, if God is so good, why does he permit sin? Well, it's because greater good will come out of that in the end. In fact, it's impossible by God's nature for him to be morally responsible for anything, because he is perfect good and perfect being, and evil is, or culpability specifically, is a privation of being, and you cannot private pure being. So God can never do anything wrong. Let's have a look at the questions. We have been going for... We'll try and end it at around an hour, I think. Also, request from you fellas. I know that there are 50 of you watching, and there have been, different spikes, peaks and troughs throughout this. But if you have any videos you'd like me to stream about, please do not hesitate to put them on the Riot, or to mention them in the live chats of the streams. Because I actually quite enjoy in responding to these videos, because it gives me a real focus. And I can express thoughts in a much more free-flowing conversational manner with a video than I can through, say, structuring a talk, like I sometimes do. Now, granted, responding to a video takes a lot longer, but sometimes it's easier to understand if you hear it from a dialogue position. Let's see that. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I don't forget. Yeah, I mean, the thing with Ayaan Hirsi Ali is that she existed in a world that was purely fideist, as a lot of Sunni Islam tends to be. And then she moved over to a world that didn't want to kill her. So, I mean, I hope God's got a plan for her. As much as that is a stereotype to say, it is true. Have you read Ethics or The Cost of Discipleship by Bonhoeffer? No, I haven't. If you ask me if I've read a book, chances are I haven't, because there are so many books. So I'm going to bring this to a close here. If you have requests for videos for me to do streams on, I am more than willing to check them out, provided they are, of course, relevant to the channel. If you want to stick those in the comments or, wherever, so that I can see them, I'm more than willing to respond, if they are, up to the standard of what I'd like to review on the channel. Anyway, see you later, guys. I hope you found this at least somewhat insightful, if not just entertaining. I'll see you later, and goodbye.